Welcome to the next session. I think this is session 23 of Exploring LDS History. Thank you for being here this week. If you're watching online or on video, thank you for joining us. And as always, I just want to say I'm trying as hard as I can, and I hope it comes across this way. As we look at the founding of the LDS Church, I want to be as loving as I can possibly be and as gracious as I can possibly be. But at the same time, I want to be truthful and I want to be honest with what the history says. And so it's never my intention to come across as being harsh or critical or offensive, but I do want to be honest with what history can tell us, because these are important questions that we're trying to answer together. So I hope God will give me the grace to do that today. So we left off last time, just to recap, in the coming towards the end of 1834, and just real quickly, we talked about Zion's camp, which is the army that Joseph Smith raised to go and redeem Zion, the displaced Mormons who'd been run out of Jackson County in Missouri. And so he raised an army of about 200 people, and under revelation of God, God said, I'm going to use this army to run the Gentiles out, and so that you can reclaim Jackson County. And so they traveled to Missouri, and the whole thing was just one big problem after another. To put it kindly, nothing went right. They got there and realized they didn't have the numbers, and they had another revelation from God where God said, just kidding, I did all this as a test of your faith, and you need to go back to Ohio. And so Zion's camp was a colossal failure from beginning to end, and one of the big failures of Joseph Smith's career. And it wasn't over for him, because God said go back to Ohio, but before he could get back to Ohio, he had another crisis waiting for him when he got back to Kirtland. You might remember a few weeks ago we talked about Sylvester Smith, who was a particular thorn in his side through all of the Zion's camp campaign. They butted heads, they didn't get along, and he didn't agree with anything Smith did. Well, he raced back to Ohio ahead of Smith in the army, and so by the time Smith got back, he had to face the families of the 14 men who died of cholera on the expedition. But he also had to face a trial by the High Council of the church in Kirtland, because Sylvester Smith had gotten there ahead of him and stirred up all kinds of problems. And Talon, probably just being honest with what a terrible debacle the whole thing of Zion's camp was. Because remember, when they left, this is the army going to redeem Zion. We're going to reclaim it. So nothing had worked out. So no sooner does Smith get home than he has to defend himself. This is what he said he was met with when they got back to Ohio. I was met with a catalog of charges as black as the author of lies himself. And the cry was tyrant, pope, king usurper, abuser of men, angel, false prophet, prophesying lies in the name of the Lord, taking consecrated monies, and every other lie to fill up and complete the catalog. So they weren't happy with him. And this is what amazes me, is that Smith was able, underneath that kind of attitude when he got back, he was able to turn the entire situation around. And on that trial before the High Council in Kirtland, he argued for 6 hours straight, defending himself and defending his decisions and defending Zion's camp. And by the end, he was able to take all of Sylvester Smith's arguments and actually turn them against him. And in the end, Sylvester Smith was the one who apologized. Which to me, that says a lot about Joseph Smith's. It's hard to keep up with all the Smiths sometimes. It says a lot about Joseph Smith's powers of persuasion and his ability to take a crowd and draw them to his point of view. They actually got Sylvester Smith to publish a public apology. This was in the Latter-day Saints Messenger and Advocate, where he says, I know I came out and I said a lot of horrible things about Joseph Smith and what happened in Zion's camp. And the highlighted part there at the end, Sylvester says, but I am now perfectly satisfied that the errors of which I accused him before the council did not exist, and were never committed by him. And my contrition has been and still continues to be deep, because I admitted thoughts into my heart which were not right concerning him. So he was even able to get Smith to publicly apologize, and not just publicly apologize. And these two had butted heads in a serious way. They were not friendly at all. He not only got him to apologize publicly, they were able to be reconciled enough that Sylvester Smith stayed in good standing with the church. He would leave in 1838 when we get to the Kirtland banking scandal. He left with a lot of others. But in that period in between, they reconciled, and he was actually a member of the first quorum of the 70. And so he was able to restore that relationship. So that says a lot to me about the kind of person Joseph Smith was. And I think Smith learned from Zion's camp, which was a major failure and debacle. No matter how you look at it, it was just a farce and it was a mess. But I think he learned from it, because there's a period here where Smith becomes less boisterous. He becomes less, rah, there's no more big things. We're going to go claim Zion, that kind of boisterous big things. But who cares what the government says? Who cares what anybody says kind of attitude. He becomes a lot more conciliatory. He starts showing a lot more wisdom in the way he deals with the government, in the way that he deals with people. And so as a result, after Zion's camp, there's a period of about 4 years where the church has relative peace in terms of any kind of persecution or problems with the authorities. And the saints in Missouri are still displaced. They still have, they're in neighboring Clay County. They still can't go back to Jackson County. But there's relative peace for a period of few years. And Smith uses this period. We start to see the structure of the church as we know it today in terms of leadership and authority. It's in this period that it begins to develop. He also learned, I think, from Zion's camp that I need to be a little bit more sparring with the way I dole out revelations. And you've probably noticed, if you've been here for all these classes, you can see in the early, up through like chapter 110 of Doctrine and Covenants or so, when you look at them in historical context, they're all reactionary, right? A problem comes up and Smith has a revelation to meet it. And then another problem comes up and he has a revelation to meet it. And that's why you have, like, on one hand, it's going, you're going to be like Moses and go free Zion. And the next minute, 2 months later, it's another revelation going, nope, I was just testing your faith. And he's just reacting to circumstances to try to get through it. And I think he learns that's not the best way to go about things. Over the next 10 years, there are only about a dozen revelations that are contained. So from this period until about 1834, until the end of Joseph Smith's life, we only have 10 more revelations in Doctrine and Covenants, where in the previous 5 years, there's over 100. I think also part of the reason that we start to see him using the revelation as much as it became, because the authority structure of the church becomes more developed and his authority becomes more developed, it wasn't necessary for him to have to say quite so often, "Thus saith the Lord," because his position becomes established enough that it was enough for him. He didn't have to say "God says" anymore. It was just enough for him to be able to say, "I say it," right? The prophet says, and that was enough authority to be able to do what he wanted to do without having to resort to using "Thus saith the Lord" to do it. And so we kind of see that happening in this time period. So he turns his attention to the building of the temple in Kirtland, because you might remember he's hung a lot on this, that and now in that revelation to return to Ohio after Zion's camp, that revelation had said that Zion is not going to be redeemed until the Kirtland temple is finished and you receive the endowment. And he's built up this, we got to finish the temple because God's going to give us this awesome endowment whenever the temple is done. And so they throw themselves into that. People who had the money to do it or something to mortgage, they donated lumber, they donated materials. Everybody donated sweat and labor to it. In just one instance I wanted to give you today of the generosity of some of the saints in this time period. There was a man named John Tanner who had converted in New York and sold 2 farms and 2,200 acres of timber, which got a huge chunk of money. And he was migrating from New York to join the saints in Missouri. And on the way in Kirtland, when he stopped over, he realized, was told that the mortgage on the Kirtland Temple lot was about to be foreclosed upon, and they were going to lose the whole thing. So he loaned the Temple Committee $13,000 in 1834 dollars, $13,000 to get the mortgage current. He signed a note with Smith for $30,000 to purchase goods that they needed, and he gave Smith a personal loan of $2,000, which was a lot. That's a year's salary and then some, in 1834. A lot of money. And he never asked Smith to repay the loan. And Smith never repaid it. Smith never mentioned it again. In fact, 9 years later, he approached Joseph Smith and gave him that note where he said, "You owe me $2,000. And Smith said, "What do you want me to do with this?" And Tanner's response was, "Just do whatever you want." And Smith never did repay him. And so that kind of generosity, he eventually joined the church in Missouri, and then he eventually joined the church in Utah. And his kids said, he donated more than $500,000 to the church in today's currency, to the point that there was a point he only had $7.50 left in his checking account. That kind of generosity among the early saints is what kept things afloat and what kept them running. Smith tended to reward that kind of loyalty and generosity with positions in the church, but he also always felt a special indebtedness to the men who had marched with him as part of Zion's camp. And so in 1835, when he instituted the Quorum of the 12 Apostles for the first time, 9 of the apostles and the initial quorum of 70 elders, 9 of the apostles and all of the 70 had been a part of Zion's camp with him. And so he obviously appreciated the loyalty that those men had shown in that expedition. It's also during this time period that Smith changed the... I didn't do it. What is that? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. It was a phone. I didn't know what it was. I thought we'd burst a pipe. I'm like, what's leaking? I thought that had busted a leak. It's so hot, the swamp cooler exploded. It's also during this time period that Smith changed his title from first elder to president of the church. And I think it's interesting that they chose the title president. All the other titles he chose for all the other offices, apostle, elder, those are all biblical terms. President is not a biblical term, but it carries a lot of weight in America, right? And in terms of the authority he was exercising, it better reflected the authority that he had in the church. And so when they shuffled things around, at this point they ended up with 5 councils that governed the church, and in theory all of them had equal authority. So you had the first presidency with the first president and his 2 counselors, just like we have today. And this is where we get to see the modern structure of the church taking shape. You have the 12 apostles, you have the quorum of the 70, and then you had the Missouri High Council and the Kirtland High Council. And in theory, they all had equal authority. In fact, by revelation, they all had equal authority. This is what Doctrine and Covenants says, that the Melchizedek priesthood, 3 presiding high priests, chosen by the body, appointed and ordained to that office, and upheld by the confidence, faith, and prayer of the church, form a quorum of the presidency of the church. And the 12 traveling counselors are called to be the 12 apostles, and they form a quorum equal in authority and power to the 3 presidents previously mentioned. So the first presidency and the 12 apostles, they have equal authority. And the 70 also, they form a quorum equal in authority to that of the 12 apostles. And every decision made by these must be unanimous. And as long as it's unanimous, it carries the same weight and authority as any of the other governing bodies. So this was intended to be a system of checks and balances, right? We have these different quorums and these different authorities, and they govern the church, but they all have equal authority. Sounds good on paper, sounds good in Revelation even. Problem is, it didn't work out in practice that way, ever. Very quickly, the 12 apostles kind of took over. They were all Joseph Smith's favorite men. That's how they ended up being apostles. They were all closest to him. And they quickly garnered so much power that the Kirtland Council said, they're just a bunch of outlaws. They just do whatever they want. And so they were butting heads almost immediately. They did whatever they wanted, and they listened to nobody except Joseph Smith. And so he was loyal to them. They were loyal to him. And part of the reason for this, if you think about it, the oldest person on the 12 was 36. Right? So it's a bunch of young men. And young men are visionaries, and young men are going to take over the world, and young men know everything, and nobody else knows anything, right? When you're young. And they were all young. Smith wouldn't turn 30 till the end of the year. Several of them were only 24. And so they were all young guys. And so there was a lot of sparks between them and everybody else. But they quickly gathered a whole lot more authority than everybody else. W.W. Phelps gave nicknames to all of them that stuck for the rest of their life. You might have even heard the one for Brigham Young before. Brigham Young, he labeled the Lion of the Lord. Orson Pratt was the Gauge of philosophy. And Parley Pratt was the Archer of paradise. And Lyman White was the Wild Ram of the mountains. And so he gave them all these colorful nicknames that stuck. And they built up a lot of power very quickly. And so it became really clear pretty quick that despite the fact God had just said, right, in the Revelation I just read, that you're all going to have equal authority, it became pretty clear pretty fast that was never going to work. And Smith eventually declared that the president's job is to preside over the whole church like Moses. And so very quickly it became the presidency is the authority of the church, and then very much the way it is today, right? They don't all have equal authority today. There's the first presidency, and then there's the 12, and you've got the quorum of 70 underneath that, but they're not equal in the authority that they have. And so over time, Joseph Smith's word became the law, and there was no appeal. The council eventually declared that an insult against the prophet was an insult against the whole body. And it became, if you insulted the prophet, it became an excommunicatable, boy, that's a tough word. It became an offense for which they'd kick you out of the church. And just keep that in mind when we talk about the next subject in a couple minutes. So the trappings of the church were very democratic, but they were essentially autocratic in function. It was whatever the president says goes. And I believe, I meant to look into this more and ran out of time, I believe this is the way it still functions today. I think they still vote every year to confirm the general authorities. I think they still do that at General Conference, but I'm not positive. But they would vote every year to confirm the general authorities, but there was only one slate of candidates to vote for, and they were appointed by the president. And so everybody voted, but there wasn't a whole lot of options in terms of who you're going to vote for. Smith also remained incredibly loyal to his family. And I think what we'll talk about in the next few minutes here, it shows how much family meant to Smith, and that you don't mess with family kind of mentality. All of his family had positions of prestige in the church. His dad was made the patriarch of the church. His brother Hiram Smith was his first counselor in the first presidency, and if he hadn't been killed with Joseph Smith, likely he would have been next in line to Smith. His brother Don Carlos, who even though he was only 18 at this time, I believe, he was made president of the high priests. His brother Samuel was put in charge of all LDS publications, and his brother William was named to the quorum of the 12 apostles. And this is going to be a decision, I don't know if Smith regretted it, but it was going to be a problem for him for years and years to come. The fact that he put William on the 12. The other four were go along and get along kind of guys. They were happy to follow Smith's leadership. They were good team players. William was not a team player at all. In fact, the other 11 didn't want him to be part of the 12. They all wanted Phineas Young, Brigham Young's brother, to get that last spot in the quorum of the 12. And Smith overrode them and insisted that William be put in the quorum of the 12. William was not a team player. He was outspoken. He was opinionated. He was cranky. Nobody could get along with him. He did not play well with others. And you see it even in the apostolic blessing when he was appointed to the 12. Oliver Cowdery prayed over him. And you might remember a couple months ago, we read several of those, and they were all, Brigham Young, you're going to reach 1 million people for Jesus. And the next guy, you're going to do all these awesome things and work miraculous signs. But when Cowdery prayed over William, he said, we pray that he will be purified in heart, that he may be equal with his brethren. So that's not a flattering thing to say. They're just saying, we hope this works out. that he can just get to the point the rest of us are, right? And he never did. And so just a couple instances of where this became a problem. William brought a complaint against a Mormon father for beating his 15-year-old daughter. And so when they had the ecclesiastical trial over that, Joseph sided with the father because he realized that William's interest was more attraction to the girl than it was concern for the girl. And so he sided with the father, and William lost his mind. And he resigned his spot in the apostleship, and he went up and down the street railing against Joseph Smith, calling him a false prophet, calling him all kinds of horrible names, all things that would have gotten anybody else in the church kicked out. And made a big stink. And all the other apostles are going, yeah, we need to kick him out. Joseph, he can't talk about you like this. And they wanted to excommunicate him. And Smith's like, no, we need to forgive him. We need to restore him. He needs to keep his spot. And they fought him so hard on it that he ultimately had to resort to revelation to convince them to let William back in to the 12. And this is that revelation. This is one that was never published in Doctrine and Covenants, but it's in History of the Church, where God says, as for my servant William, let the 11 humble themselves in prayer and faith, and wait on me in patience, and my servant William will return, and I will yet make him a polished shaft in my quiver, in bringing down the wickedness and abominations of men, and there will be none mightier than he in his day and generation. Which never happened, by the way. If you're keeping tally of how many revelations never came true, this is just another one. He would continue to be a thorn in the side. But Joseph forces the issue, and they let him back in. And so he ends up scolding the 11 rather than William. And that turned out to be a mistake because William came back more outspoken and opinionated and sure of himself that I can just do whatever I want than he had been before. So we organized a debating society that would meet every week or two and essentially to practice debating skills, but it just became a big, huge gripe session about everything that William didn't like. And so Smith happened into one of these one night when he was being overly critical, and he reproached William for the tenor of their discussion, like, you guys don't need to be talking with this kind of attitude. And William lost his mind and began to rant and rail against Joseph Smith, and this is in the presence of other people. And Joseph Smith Sr., so their dad, listened quietly until he called Smith a tyrant and an imposter. And then Dad stepped in and said, boys, that's enough. Knock it off. You guys are acting like kids. Quit it. And Joseph Smith listened to his dad, bowed out. I'm sorry, Dad. And he tried to leave peaceably. And William says, I'll say whatever I want to say in my own house. And Joseph responded, then I'll speak too because I built this house. And it's as much mine as it is yours. And then William lost his mind, cold-cocked Joseph, and then literally beat the living daylights out of him until Hiram drug him off. It was embarrassing for Smith because he prided him very, very much in his prowess as a wrestler. Well, for any guy, right? It's never a good thing of pride to go, I got beat up. So it was embarrassing for Smith, and this is more than he gave him a black eye. He beat him severely. There was rumors going around Kirtland that Smith had died. Took him several days to recover. So it was a severe, severe beating. And church members are going, how is William staying in the church? How are you allowed to beat the prophet within an inch of his life and still stay in the church? Another instance, I'll come back to William. Earlier in the year, Smith's brother-in-law, Calvin, who was married to Smith's sister, Sophronia, he had been accused Smith of depriving him of water rights, and they got in an argument. And in that argument, he called Smith a damned false prophet, publicly out in the street. And then Smith decked him and knocked him to the ground. And so Calvin brought suit against Joseph Smith in court for assault. And the amazing thing is, by the time it went to court, and here's the court records that still survive till today of that trial, by the time it went to court, Smith had convinced Stoddard to drop all of the charges and reconcile. And again, so you see this powerful ability to persuade. They called several witnesses, including Smith's mom, including William, and they tried to argue self-defense. But at the end of the day, the judge says, the plaintiff is saying he's satisfied and he's not asking for any damages, so they dismissed the suit because Smith had worked it out with them beforehand. So church members were stunned that Smith's family could get away with acting like this. How can they stay in the church? How are they allowed to talk like this about the prophet? There's other instances in this same time period where one church member, I don't remember his name, but a member of the church had spoken publicly that he thought Joseph Smith was extorting money for the church because he took $12 to buy a new ledger book. And he thought that was way too much. You don't need $12 to buy a new ledger book. And so he was critical publicly of Joseph Smith for that, and they excommunicated him. And so there's instances like that where you speak bad about the prophet and they're kicking people out. And here you got William beating him to death, nearly to death, and Calvin suing him and taking him to court, and they're still around. And how does that work? Like I said, he was beaten so severely that he was crippled for several days. The 11 forced his resignation as an apostle. And this amazes me. Again, Smith fought it. And fought to have him reinstated. And eventually got him reinstated again as one of the 12 apostles. And he published, after the beating, he published publicly in one of the newspapers this statement where he said, "I freely forgive you, and you know my unshaken and unchangeable disposition. I know whom I trust. I know I stand upon the rock. You know the doctrine I teach is true, even though you're saying I'm a false prophet. You know it's true. You know that God has blessed me. I brought salvation to my father's house when we were in a miserable situation." He's reminding them, you remember how poor we are and how poverty-stricken we were when we were in New York. But he publicly forgives him and has him reinstated. And so that says something to me about the importance of family in Joseph Smith's mindset. I love my brothers. I do. But I don't know. If one of my brothers beat me within an inch of my life, that takes some doing to get to the forgiveness part, right? And so you see just how much family meant to him. William ultimately, though, did make a public confession before the High Council. And you see in this time period, this becomes Smith's pattern. He was great at reconciling with his foes, and he becomes much more conciliatory, and he's able to swing people back around. But he uses this public confession. That kind of becomes his biggest whip in his arsenal, where a lot of times all he has to do to keep people in line is threaten them with having to make a public confession. And that's usually enough to get them back in line. But Williams confessed publicly, and he was reinstated and would continue to be a thorn in everybody else's side. All right, one other big thing that happened in this time period. The mid-30s were, again, a period of peace for the church, and so it left them with nothing much to argue about except theology and doctrine. And so you see a lot of LDS doctrine beginning to take shape in this time period too. And if you read the history of the church in this time period, it's largely a series of ecclesiastical trials of church members where they're being tried before the High Council for sexual misbehavior or drinking whiskey or heresy. And during this time period in American history, and this is important for how this came about, the temperance movement is starting to take full swing, right? It's gaining momentum. There was, for a brief period in the mid-1800s, a political party that was based largely on this one issue of banning alcohol. And so in 1834, there were 5,000 temperance societies in America. Almost all of them were in the North. It was a huge issue for the northern half of the country, and almost all of that 90% that were in the North, the biggest concentration of them was in New York and Ohio. And so they were upset not just about alcohol, but tobacco and coffee and a whole host of other reasons. So you look at the publications from the time period, and they say things like that tobacco is a nerve-destroying, soul-paralyzing drug, a fleshly, ungodly lust. And they said coffee is deplored as a stimulant that causes one to be overly amorous. And so you should avoid coffee. Don't go home and drink a gallon after church today. But causes you to be a little overexcited if you have too much coffee, and so you shouldn't drink it. Tea drinking was equated to toddy guzzling. I don't know, I can't imagine how you would think that about tea, but a lot of people did. And then you had publications like the Journal of Health that said, you know, the reason the Irish are so robust is they just eat meat and cabbage, right? They don't eat much, potatoes and cabbage. They don't eat much meat, and that's the reason Irish people are so robust. And so meat should be avoided, and they were encouraging a vegetarian diet. So that was the climate and the thinking of a lot of people during this time period, and it was the thinking of a lot of the saints. So in 1833, Smith penned what's probably his most famous revelation of all, and even if you've never read it, you probably have heard of the Word of Wisdom, which is very important to members of the church even to today. And it suggested, and it wasn't a command, and we'll read it in just a second, it suggested that saints refrain from alcohol, tobacco, hot drinks, that they use wine only in communion, and they eat meat only during winter and during hard times when there was nothing else to eat. But they were just given kind of as good advice, not as a command. And that's because Smith himself wasn't, a lot of his people thought this way, but he didn't really think this way. And he enjoyed the fruit of the vine on occasion, and he enjoyed it a lot. And he didn't want to come out and say with a hard line, we can't drink, because he didn't want to stop drinking. But here is the commandment in part. If you've never actually read it, I thought it might be valuable enough just to walk through it. The word of wisdom says, not by commandment or constraint, but by revelation and a word of wisdom, showing forth the order and will of God and the temporal salvation of all saints. Behold, verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, in consequence of the evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, I have warned you and forewarned you by giving unto you this word of wisdom by revelation. So you can see where it gets, why they call it the word of wisdom. Inasmuch as any man drinketh wine or strong drink among you, behold, it is not good, neither meat in the sight of your Father, only in assembling yourselves together to offer up your sacraments before him. And behold, this should be wine, yea, pure wine, of the grape of the vine of your own make. So just keep that in your mind. God says here by revelation, you should use wine when you take the sacraments, right? It continues, again, strong drinks are not for the belly, but for the washing of your bodies. And tobacco is not for the body, neither for the belly, and is not good for man, but it's an herb for bruises and all sick cattle. So you can use it medicinally, but to be used with judgment and skill. And hot drinks are not for the body or the belly. Yea, flesh also of the beast and of the fowls of the air, I the Lord have ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly, and it's pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of cold or of famine. So you should avoid meat, but right in the winter, you've gone through your stocks from the fall, whatever, the canned goods, right? When all you've got to eat is meat, that's fine. But you should avoid eating meat when you can. So all that's a suggestion. But God pretty clearly says, don't do it, right? And if I want to do what God says, I'm going to want to do this because you can call it a word of wisdom, but God says here, tobacco's not for your body, and strong drink's not for your body. And so most saints chose to heed this admonition. Brigham Young, however, gave this account. He says this is how the word of wisdom came about. And I love this story, so it's worth reading. Brigham Young said, I am as well acquainted with the circumstances which led to the giving of the word of wisdom as any man in the church, and this was 20 years later, although I wasn't present at the time to witness them. The first school of the prophets was held in a small room situated over the prophet Joseph's kitchen. When they assembled together in this room after breakfast, the first thing they did was to light their pipes, and while smoking, talk about the great things of the kingdom and spit all over the room. And as soon as the pipe was out of their mouth, a large chew of tobacco would then be taken. Often when the prophet entered the room to give the school instructions, he would find himself in a cloud of tobacco smoke. This and the complaints of his wife at having to clean so filthy a floor made the prophet think upon the matter. And he inquired of the Lord relating to the conduct of the elders in using tobacco, and the revelation known as the word of wisdom was the result. So the real reason we have the word of wisdom is Emma was sick and tired of cleaning up their tobacco spit off the floor every week where they were spitting all over the room, at least according to Brigham Young, who was in the know. All right. The problem became that for several years, that was 1833, but Smith never took his own counsel seriously. It might have been a word of wisdom, but he didn't stop drinking. And there's several places in his journal where he mentions that he drank. At a wedding, he said, we took some refreshments and our hearts were made glad with the fruit of the vine. At another wedding 2 weeks later, he said, after being given 3 servings of wine at a wedding, it fell my lot to attend to this duty which I cheerfully discharged. Our hearts were made glad while partaking of the bounty of the earth which was presented, until we had taken our fill, and joy filled every bosom. Well, this is 3 years after the revelation was given, and the prophet's still drinking, and a lot of people knew the prophet was drinking. But by then, the High Council had made it a serious offense. They were trying to enforce the word of wisdom and make sure the saints were keeping it. And so it became a source of embarrassment. And there's actually records of, church members who are brought before the council on charges of drinking alcohol. And they go, what? The prophet drinks it? Right? Which is a pretty good defense if you think about it. What? We're not doing anything the prophet doesn't do. And so it was a source of embarrassment, and Sidney Rigdon, who was part of the first presidency at this time, it was Smith and Hiram and Rigdon made up the first presidency. He was a radical temperance supporter. And so Smith eventually caved to the public pressure, and he got behind it, and he allowed Rigdon in 1836 to change their practice in church meetings to where now, even today, when they take sacrament, you use water in bread, and you don't use wine or grape juice in bread. And that's when this change was made, which I just find interesting when the word of wisdom says you should use it in sacrament meeting. But they were such radical, the temperance movements were so radical at the time, they changed it even for the little sip you take during communion. But implementation of that was gradual over time. It wasn't until 1852, and all of this comes directly from the church's website last week, so it's current. It wasn't until 1852 that the word of wisdom became a binding commandment in which saints agreed to abstain from tea, coffee, tobacco, and all things mentioned in the word of wisdom. And today, bishops use it, so in the LDS congregations in your ward, if you want to go to the temple and have your endowments and do your temple work, you have to have a recommend from your bishop in order to be able to get into the temple, where you go and you're questioned by the bishop to see if you're worthy to go to the temple. And part of what they use in determining that worthiness is, do you follow the word of wisdom? And so it's still a matter of debate, and you might have found this in talking with Mormon friends today on how strictly do we need to keep this. For a lot, it's a badge of honor to follow it very, very strictly and observe everything in the word of wisdom. So it continues to be one of the probably most important revelations on a day-to-day basis in the LDS Church. So that's how the word of wisdom came about. In 2 weeks, don't miss in 2 weeks and bring your friends. I'm sorry, in 3 weeks. On August 20th, however many weeks that is, when I will be back. We'll have our next class, August 20th. We'll learn about the pearl of great price, which if you're not familiar with, and you have to weigh for yourself the evidence on everything we have talked about to this point. If you are still hedging on whether you think Joseph Smith could have been a prophet, the pearl of great price is, I think, the single most damning piece of evidence against Joseph Smith being a prophet. It's so damaging, I think, to be almost overwhelming evidence that Joseph Smith could not have been who he claimed to be. And we'll look at how the pearl of great price came about in 3 weeks. So make sure you're here for that. Thanks for being here this morning. Let's pray together and we'll escape the heat.